Hi everybody, so this is the second take, and what I'd like to talk about briefly is a comment that Marshall and Mary brought up, which was on standard and non-standard English, which I thought was really fantastic. I'm glad you guys brought it up and started talking about it. That question, what is standard and non-standard, seems to always emerge, especially around contrastive rhetoric and world Englishes. So I would pose the question to everybody to think about. If you haven't already started thinking about it, what do we mean by standard English? And what do we mean by non-standard English? And the next question is, who speaks standard English and who speaks non-standard English? And the third question to consider is, who decides which form is standard and non-standard, which form is legitimate and which form is not legitimate, so on and so forth. So if we reflect on that and go to the literature and look at what the critical camp, for example, like Ryoko Kubota and Suresh Kanagaraj and others might say that, well, in a North American context, standard English largely probably refers to the English that's spoken by white middle-class people. For it's the teachers, curriculum developers, policymakers, dictionary writers and producers, those who are involved in assessment, as well as the raters who rate sample pieces of writing for provincial or state exams, are largely white middle-class people. And so decisions largely reflect a white middle-class positionality, as I think they would probably describe it. So those kinds of things are, important questions for all language teachers to really stop and consider. There is a very sort of maybe cliche expression, but it came to mind, where somebody asked, what's the difference between a language and a dialect? And the response would be, some of you may already know this, is that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And so the sense of power is very much involved in terms of which form of the language has authority. And I think it was Rosanna had mentioned about Bourdieu and talking about the notion of social, cultural, and academic capital that students may bring to a writing classroom. And that's certainly the case, that those notions of standard and non-standard are certainly very much involved in what Bourdieu's notion of capital. And I'd like to kind of give a very quick example from my own research experience that draws on the notions of standard, non-standard, and Bourdieu's notion of capital. Last year I was collecting data in an after-school literacy program, and I was observing tutors and tutees composing. So the students would bring in writing and they'd work with their tutor on it. And in one situation, there was a tutor. She was a woman, Canadian woman in her mid-50s, white, probably upper middle class background, came from a very well-educated family. And when she spoke she's a very glib speaker, in the sense that spoke in paragraphs, not in sort of the peripatetic speech that you're hearing from me. The student she was paired with was a newcomer to Canada, maybe a year or two. She'd been here, a young woman, 15, came from a Caribbean island, and she had a lot of interruption in her schooling. She was reading at about a grade 3 level. So tutor was helping her with her reading and writing for school. And there was one situation I remember where the young woman was reading, and she pronounced the word A-S-K-E-D as A-X-E-D. So she finished reading the passage. The tutor then stopped and redirected her back to that verb and said to her, quote, "I'm going to show you how to pronounce it the correct way," unquote. So in the interview that I did later on with both of the participants, the tutor had told me that it was her job in that moment to empower the student by letting her know which was the right way, again, the right way of pronouncing that word. The student told me that when she first arrived in Canada, that she wrote in the form of English that was very representative of where she was from, and where she was from, English was also the first main language. But the Canadian system had really helped her purge her of her native variety of English, which I got the sense she felt was inferior or broken compared to Canadian English. So in these moments, I think as teachers, it's something that's very important that we really stop and consider, the message that we send to our students about standard and non-standard, especially if the student is coming from, on the continuum, another country where English is the main language. And if you want to read more about this in terms of looking at theoretical frameworks around varieties of English and degrees of power, you should look at Kachru and Nelson. That's K-A-C-H-R-U and Nelson, I believe 1996. And they came up with a theory of concentric circles. Inner circle English, which is Canada, the US, the UK, Ireland, Australia. Outer circle English are those countries that were colonized by the British. And expanding world countries are, Mexico, Brazil, Japan, countries where English is now becoming very much a part of the curriculum very early on and are seen as important factors of success. Now that notion has also been problematized by the critical camp by these concentric circles are being seen as too static. But in this example, it allows us at least a way to talk about degrees of what standard and non-standard mean. And in this particular power situation between the tutor and student, what then does the student feel about the variety of English that she's been raised to speak? And one would wonder if a Canadian went down to this particular island in the Caribbean, would the variety of Canadian English be seen as inferior, lacking, or somehow illegitimate? I don't think so. So those are all things to consider, and they're certainly very much a part of contrastive rhetoric. I do want to give you a quote by Lisa Delpit, who is an African-American educator, and she very much believes that students who are of color or from low socioeconomic backgrounds that are in sort of these mainstream schools where the curriculum is driven and written for white people of a particular class, that she feels it's very important that students have access to all the same tools and knowledges that that are designed for the curriculum. And here's a quote I'd like to read to you. She says, "Many liberal educators hold that the primary goal for education is for children to become autonomous, to develop fully who they are in the classroom setting without having arbitrary outside standards forced upon them. This is a very reasonable goal for people whose children are already participants in the culture and power and who already have internalized its codes." So it's another way for us to start thinking about what we're teaching, the curriculum, and just being largely aware of the varieties of English that appear in the classroom, and following the curriculum, but also being sort of sensitive to the multiplicity of languages and dialects and so on and so forth that are in our classrooms, because behind all these dialects and accents are human faces. So lastly, I did want to leave an example of two things you may want to look at. One is by Tony Silva, which he wrote an article called "Students' Right to Their Own Language," which was sort of a mandate for language teachers and policymakers to think about when ESL students, for example, are in a classroom, in a writing classroom, in a curriculum, how they need to be respected in terms of their language, the culture, the backgrounds, things that they bring in terms of fair practices and assessment. And this was in response to actually a much earlier piece that was written in 1972 in the 3 Cs, which is the College Composition and Communication Journal, in which they published a very, very well-known mandate called Students' Rights to Their Own Language. And in this piece, very typical of the times, I suspect, these compositionists encouraged that students were able to write in their own way, in their own voice, if you will, and that they shouldn't be tethered or bound by these quote-unquote standards. Well, that certainly had a big backlash, and there were certainly a lot of well-meaning, intentioned people who I think were largely drawing on the expressivist movement in writing, which was Peter Elbow's writing, or where he was drawing a lot of his inspiration from. And this was sort of in response to that. And it certainly was, gave rather lip service to various varieties of English. So anyway, I'd like to stop there with that, and in the next following podcast, I'm going to introduce the readings for this next week. Thank you again very much. I have a lot more to say on this topic, but I better keep it short. Thank you again, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.